Welcome back to the Story Podcast. After a couple weeks off, we are together to talk about Chapter 12, The Trials of a King. We are so glad you're with us today. All right. Well, hey, Steve, after a couple weeks off, we've kind of missed being together here.
Yeah.
We took some time off for Easter. Did you have a good Easter?
I did have a good Easter. And, it's so great to be back in the story. I don't know how you feel about it.
Same.
But I love the story.
Yeah.
And it's really just the way, they do such a good job of tying together and weaving it into one story that sometimes you have to bounce around to get all the angles on it. But even in the message this week, as I was looking at that Psalm passage.
The Psalms are really good in this.
Yeah. And so it's nice that the story weaves that in and shows you, this is what he was thinking.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So a little programming note. We are going to do 6 weeks of the story, which will take us into about the first week of June. Then we are going to take a little break for the summer. And then we're going to come back and finish up at the last, I think it's like 15 chapters right in a row, August, September, October. And so, but we've got 6 great weeks between now and June, starting with this week's. And boy, what a great job you did on a really important passage. So why are you laughing?
Well, it's a nice segue out of Easter. It's like, he's risen, resurrection.
Right.
By the way, you can screw it all up.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no, it's
which King David does, sort of does it in this passage.
So this week you face the classic preacher's challenge in the story, in that you've got tons of material. To use, focus in on one part or zoom back, and you focused in on one part, which I think was really wise this week. But for the podcast, I actually want to kind of pull back and look at all of this in the story. So I kind of broke it up into 4 sections, starting with the one that you really preached on, which is the story of David and Bathsheba. And I think we all, really, relate to it because it's such a traumatic and dramatic story.
It is.
But I thought by just a lot of this you covered on Sunday, but maybe just start by some of the practical mistakes that you see David make. The chapter begins with in the spring when the kings go out to war.
Right.
That's always such a haunting passage.
I think the real mistake that David makes, and that so many of us make, is in this pathway towards terrible consequences.
Right.
There were multiple off-ramps, and he didn't take them.
Yeah.
He could have stopped it at any point, and yet he continued to cover up. He continued to, just kind of live in his kingly world where I get to do whatever I want to do. And as a result, the sin went from small to worse. It starts with lust, and temptation and lust.
Right.
It ends up with adultery. It ends up with murder after that. It's just again and again and again. He had an off-ramp and he didn't take it.
Right. It's hard to put your finger on this, but you mentioned kind of this kingly, I can do whatever I want sort of attitude. Do you think, what is it that inspires us and David to do that, to miss those off-ramps, or to refuse those off-ramps? You were saying this is called the trials of the king. Yeah. It's really not a trial.
It was
the knucklehead behavior of the king after God's heart. Why do we miss those things?
The root of it all is selfishness. We want what we want, and when we get locked in on what we want, we refuse to hear. Even thank God Nathan comes into the story at the end, and David receives it the way he did, right? Because if he, hypothetically, if he would have just ignored Nathan or put Nathan to death, right? Yeah. Then he becomes Saul. Yeah. And maybe just a footnote in history, Right. But David responds in a different way, and we really see a different result.
Right. Hey, let's talk about Nathan. He's a bit of a footnote in this, not a footnote, but he's kind of a side character. Yeah. I did that preaching class in Tanzania, and I always use a big example on Nathan.
Oh, really?
Because, he's so wise.
Yeah.
How he approaches, how he gets David to hear hard truths, and he, gives the examples
that
people
can
relate to.
Yeah.
So I use it as an example of preaching. But talk a little bit about what Nathan must have endured and how Nathan would have gone about that.
I know that obviously Nathan already held a position of not only influence as a prophet who had spoken from God, but also a relationship with David.
He'd earned the right to be heard.
He had earned the right to be heard.
Okay.
And you know how that is. People that walk in off the street want to criticize. People that you have no standing in your life and want to throw stones at you.
Yeah,
You're like, I don't think I'm going to listen to you right now. But a good example, if it was you or I, if you walk into my office and you say, Steve, you and I have known each other for 30 years.
There's this sheep.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Walk in with some barbecue lamb. Yeah. But it would be received differently because of the relationship that's involved. And so it just highlights, realistically, the so what of that is we actually all need a Nathan in our life.
Do you have a prophet in your life?
Yeah, you got to have somebody in your life that when they speak the hard truth, your immediate response isn't like, you don't know what you're talking about. Instead, it's, oh, I better consider this because of who it's coming from and because of God's role in their life even, you know.
Yeah, I think that's a great application, that you've got to have someone that you're willing to hear the hard truth from. The other one that's a little bit just harder to, you know, to make sure we're doing it right is sometimes we're called to be a Nathan. And it's hard to say the hard thing sometimes. But
and for him, it was still upstream. It was still the king, right? It's hard to say people. It's hard to call into question the decisions or even the character of somebody that's above you in status or position. You know?
I don't think it's, you know, a great attribute of a Christian to be known as the person who always points out a person's faults. But to be willing when the Lord leads to say the hard things in a loving way. I think Nathan's like one of my heroes in this part of it. I've always really loved Nathan in this. He's such a great relief. And I mean, so many people stand out, you know, different than David. Uriah, of course, also heroic. But
filled with integrity. Good Lord, this guy who won't go home no matter what happens.
I know. Yeah, David tries to get him drunk. It's brutal.
I even almost glazed over some of that because I was trying to get to where I needed to go. But it's like, come on, man. Like, you sent him home, and then he refuses to out of integrity, and then you try and get him drunk. And he refuses to. Even drunk, I've got integrity, you know? It's like crazy. So, and then I do love the way the story includes Psalm 51 there and David's repentance, which you did a great job of talking about. You know, that's what sets him apart as a man after God's heart. But I love the little transition that the story makes to the next one. It says this. It says, the king was humbled by the same sexual weakness known to many men. I have it highlighted in mine too.
Really good. But unlike many men, David understood that his sin had broken a relationship with God. He had disappointed God by his greed, lust, and murder. David's sin was a breach in a divine friendship that needed repairing. His repentance was real, but there were still consequences for his action. And so the story goes on, and really the rest of it is kind of consequences, even indirect consequences from, you know, the failure of David.
You know, I talked about it briefly and delicately, just this role of lust and pornography that's in our society and in our culture, and it's pervasive, right? And we see the damage that it's doing. And I was really trying to highlight this idea of like we've either excused it on one side where it's been like, oh, whatever, it's everywhere, or we've demonized it into like that man can't possibly ever have anything to offer to a marriage or to you know, or to God. And it's like we don't see that, and it's we never excuse it, but at the same time we don't say that you can't be a man after God's own heart, because David still was. You know.
One of the books that's been super helpful to me and a lot of other people, I just love even the title of it, is Every Man's Battle. And it talks about, you know, even just the percentage of men that struggles somewhere with lust on there, and how do you deal with those things. And so I always found comfort in that fact that, you know, it's every man's battle, and women too. Many women are struggling with different sorts of things. But also, like you say, you don't want to also just excuse that, right? Because, you know, we're called to be, you know, men above reproach. And Paul says, you know, flee from sexual temptation, you know, from any form of sexual temptation. And so, yes.
Well, and generationally, you know, with technology,
it's really
we've got a generation of young men that have had nothing but access, and it's been normalized in a lot of ways. Guys like you and I, like, I sort of,
you had to sneak off and find a Playboy magazine.
And I, you know, I can still vividly remember finding the first fragments of a Playboy magazine on my walk to junior high school, and it was like, and squirreling that away and hiding it, and all that other stuff. But the unparalleled access that they have today has got them in a bad place, I think, sexually, even to begin with, going into marriages. And it's like, how do we help them see that you're not just sinning against, well, it talks about sinning against your own body, sinning against the Lord, and then sinning against your rightful sexual partner. And it's like, all that sin has consequences. And it's like, I want to avoid that for you. I want to avoid it for me. And I think some people think it gets easier with age, and it's like, it still rages. Absolutely.
You know, I don't know if I'm an expert enough to talk about this, but I think I've seen even just anecdotes of it, that pornography, especially for this younger generation, has really, as you were just saying, it's wreaked havoc on this younger generation of men, and we're seeing it in a lot of different ways. I mean, even dating relationships in that next generation is really wonky, and men are getting married later and unengaged, and the rise of video games. It's just kind of really emasculated men, and boy, the long-term societal problems of that. And so men need to rise up and be men. And that's one thing the church has to offer, is this call to a greater manhood that includes sexual purity, but it includes more than that. It includes living for purpose. It includes, valuing a woman. It includes living in your manhood and all of those things. And like I said, I'm not an expert on it, but I think we've seen it enough just in the people that we know and love, here in
there was a pushback a while back on the church's stance on all this stuff. The purity culture is the word that they would use, and this idea of don't, and that's all they heard from the church. I think people need to hear, like, sex is incredible, and it is a gift from God, and I am so thankful for it in my marriage. But along the way, it's like, man, there's so much baggage that you can walk into a marriage with, and then you're trying to fight against that your entire marriage. And it's like, that's why I think like older men need to speak into the lives of younger men
who want to have that conversation, even though they probably know that, even though they don't think they do. They really do. I would long for that as a young man. And Good. Well, thank you. Yeah,
it's a difficult topic.
It is, but a really important one. I'm thankful that God's word deals with it, and I think just in God's mercy, it's David. Everybody's hero, the one who goes on to, as you said, not only be mentioned in the heroes of faith, but even more than that, king in the line of David. So, anyways, that's
and
great.
Of course, you and I both know it's going to raise its ugly head again with Solomon later on.
Yes, it is. It is. Yeah. Stay tuned this week.
A little preview.
One of the immediate consequences is Bathsheba gets pregnant, has a child, and the child is sick right away. And there's this really strange thing, but I think really important and worth talking about is the child's sick and David mourns. And David mourns, and he puts ashes on his head, and he watches a vigil. And then the baby dies, and then he gets up and he cleans up and he goes back. What have you thought much about that passage? It's a really significant one for a lot of people who have lost a child. Whether that's a miscarriage or even mourning an abortion or loss of a child because of where David finds his ability to get up and rise up.
Well, David obviously is pleading with the Lord, like he's begging to the Lord for this child's life, basically. And I think there's other people that have outrage, kind of that Old Testament outrage about it. It's like, why is God taking this out on this innocent baby? Yada, yada, yada. And I can understand that pushback on it, but David is pleading with the Lord. He's begging the Lord for this child's life, even in spite of his own sin, in spite of everything that's gone on. And when the baby dies, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Like, it's that attitude that he gets to be God and I'm not, and I'm going to, but he worships is what it says, right? It says he bathes.
He worships, right?
Like he puts on lotion, I think, is that part of it? And then he goes to worship the Lord. He says, "You're still God. I'm gonna recognize you as God." And of course, not that David knew this, but certainly we know now that the next child conceived out of Bathsheba would be the one that would give us rise to Christ.
And I love what David says, too, along those lines, too. What I think helps him is he says this. He says, they're like, why are you getting up now? He says, can I bring him back again? I will go to him one day, but he cannot return to me. And so David's got hope that he's going to see that child one
eternal,
day, which theologically is so important for us. Because when you lose a child and you're like, where does that baby go? Where does that child go? King David says, I'm going to go see him one day. And I just think that's really hopeful for so many people that have lost a child.
I mentioned it in passing in one of the services, just this idea of like this baby shows up in heaven walking in the pearly gates and looks at God and says, what was that all about?
Really? That's me? That was my story?
And I think God must have looked at me and go, you have no idea what a idiot your dad is. But he was spared a lifetime of suffering and all that. I still believe that baby's an eternal soul that's walking around in heaven and someday would have a relationship with David and whatever that looks like in the heavenly realm. So
that's really hopeful. But we do see that David's family is broken, and how much of that's a consequence of those specific things. Or David was one who runs this risk that is so dangerous. He was successful in so many ways, but not in his family, and I think you see that he even devotes himself to, being king and being a warrior, but he's never quite able to do these relationships with his own kids.
Yeah.
I was thinking even that time with when it gets heated with Absalom, his son, rises up against him, and he talks to all his advisors about Absalom. Don't hurt him. Don't, I want him to be safe. I'm like, why don't you go to Absalom and tell him that?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But it's like he almost can do everything else except, make things right with his kid. What do you think about kind of, again, King David, who struggles with family, and we see the brokenness of his family?
Boy, and this is an interesting conversation between two pastors, because we see this a lot in pastors' lives.
Kids, sure.
Yeah, where there was sort of an unwritten rule that it was like, Pastor, you just love the church and God will take care of your kids. And it's like in a lot of broken families and pastors' families. And so, I remember when I went into my last church and they hired me, at the time it was a church plant of 30 people and whatever. But I remember telling them very clearly that if I thought that this job was going to cost me my family, they'd have my resignation faster than they could imagine. Yeah. And
I heard you say that before. That's been helpful to me.
Yeah, that I refuse to sacrifice my family. Now, that doesn't mean my family is perfect or that they've made all the right decisions along the way.
You never sacrificed.
Yeah, but the relationship is the one that we pour into, that we continue to pour into them. And truthfully, we're all broken people. We're not great fathers, and we still have our own baggage from our own family of origin. You and I know we do premarital counseling. We talk about that stuff. Right. So, but approaching our families one-to-one, head-on, talking about things, not sweeping it under the carpet, having those spiritual discussions and practical discussions about the consequences of sin is important to keeping our family on track.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's really good. And again, there's no guarantee that, there's people that do an amazing job and kids will still struggle. So it's not some, cut and dry formula. Yeah. But I agree with you. I think one of the things that David falls short on is just that willingness to really engage with his own kids. Yeah. And so there's a lot of consequences.
I have 3 daughters.
Yes, you do.
And you've got 3 kids.
Yeah.
And I remember there was a season in my life where every pastor, mentor, somebody like that in my life whenever I would sit with them, they would tell me about one of their kids that was off the rails. And I remember thinking to myself, I've got 3. What are the odds? All 3 of them stay on the rails. But the truth of the matter is you're like, they're still free will individuals, which Absalom is going to become. Right. I mean, we're going to see Absalom is a train wreck. Right. But there's also that like underlying how much did David contribute to this versus how much is Absalom just free will off the rails.
Right. Yeah. You got 3 great kids too. By the way, Steve, you've got a graduation. Your daughter's graduating from college. Yeah. Another daughter is getting married. Yeah. And a third daughter is getting ready to have a baby all in the next month.
It's all happening right now.
So that's awesome.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
It's a good thing. Yeah. And we ride the highs and the lows with our kids, right?
Yes, through all the ups and downs. Although here's what I will say. I don't think any of our kids are going to be caught hanging in a tree from their hair. Like
which is a great visual.
It is a great visual. You're like, come on. That's the wheels falling off. So hey, but then there's one kind of final section in the story that's always been kind of a fascinating one to me, which is David, man after God's own heart, loves the Ark of the Covenant, sees God's presence, dances before the Lord, wants to build God the temple. Yeah. He's been living in this tent. Yeah. I want to build you a permanent home, and God says, no, you shed too much blood. You're a man of war, so it's not going to be you.
Instead, you get to lead the fundraising campaign.
Instead, you get to lead the fundraising campaign, which we know is kind of like a weak deal, bad deal. But you know what? It doesn't come off like that for David.
No,
it comes off like, okay, it's not about David. Sometimes even when we, we're doing something, it's almost like, that we get to be a part of it. For David, there's this sincerity that I'm going to do my part to build the temple of the Lord, even if it's going to be the next guy. I'm going to do whatever I can to pave the way. And so there's really, I think, some beautiful sections in that last little part about David calling the people to give generously and all of the people worshiping and all of the gold they put aside and all of these things. And
you know what it highlights for me, and you know this because this happened just after Easter for both you and I. it highlights for me how much God is writing this massive story and that each of us is just in a little chapter of it. And he's using us for whatever little chapter that he has us in. We got a beautiful text message from Pastor Steve Newman, who was the pastor for 20 plus years here before you became lead pastor. And he just thanking us for the work we're doing, the results that we see God doing in Easter and in those baptisms. And both you and I responded to this idea of like, Steve had been so faithful with his chapter that it had paved the way for our chapter. And as a result, we get to serve faithfully and watch what God is doing during our chapter. But you and I both know our chapter will end. And somebody else will do it. And we will leave, hopefully this church and our lives in the best way we possibly can as the next generation comes up after us. And so I just really believe that I'm trying to live my chapter the best I can so that God can use this chapter and the next chapter.
Yeah, I hope that's encouraging to someone too, because a lot of times we get focused on like accomplishing this big thing, and sometimes that's what it is. But honestly, our call is to faithfulness. And I love David's, it's not mine to build it, but I'm going to do the best I can to call these people to worship. There's also a beautiful section in that part of Scripture. I don't think it's actually covered in the story, but because it's a little bit different. But it's when David is ready to make an offering, and he's got to get this field, and the guy tells him, "Hey, I'll give you the field for free." And David says this. He says, "No, I insist on buying it, for I will not present burnt offerings to the Lord that have cost me nothing." So David paid him 50 pieces of silver for the threshing floor and for the oxen. And I just have always been inspired by that. We're all called to play our part, and that there's a cost to it. I mean, such integrity in that section to say, I'm not going to give an offering that doesn't cost me anything.
Absolutely. And we know everything that has value in our world costs. It costs time, effort, energy, money, resources, whatever it costs. And if you're not willing to sacrifice it, you're not going to see it. God, we still live in this reaping and sowing society, right? Like God has created this pattern in this world. And so when we're looking for the harvest fields to be plentiful, we know the workers are few, we got to go get some workers. And everything that we do, I tell people this all the time, like people who are struggling financially, it's not too hard to ask and go, are you tithing? Like, are you putting God first in your finances? Because when you do, suddenly, believe it or not, for whatever reason, it works out well because God is taking care of the rest of it. And it's like, it's got to cost you something to follow Jesus. And when it does, you see the richness that comes out of it.
Yeah, I love that. And you definitely see this, you see that at the end of this chapter. And you see it, so much of these Bible passages focus on the king because that's who the story's about. But in this one, you see that the people all bring their offerings too. So that's encouraging to be,
This is the greatest capital campaign in the history of capital campaigns. He has to tell everybody, whoa.
Well, Solomon's going to overspend on the temple.
That's right.
It's not going to be small.
That was the Moses one where he said, whoa, stop. You're bringing too much, right?
Too much.
Moses and David, big capital campaign, guys.
So, so the story, chapter 12, ends, I think, in just this really serendipitous way with Psalm 23. And so after all of the ups and downs and the trials of the king, it ends with David saying, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." He's going to make me lie down. Just reflect on kind of David's relationship with God and, what we can kind of take away from that.
David's relationship with God, I think, was up and down. I think there were valleys of the shadow of death, where, even as he was probably, lamenting for this child and repenting from Uriah, not to mention on the run from Saul, right? That's the one where we see it really most dramatically. I think David experienced deep trouble and longing and calling out to God. And I also think there were times of peace in the palace where they were winning every battle and he was experiencing, victory. And I think that's the root of it for us, is that if things are up and to the right, God is present. If things are down and to the right, like God is still present. And how do we recite the 23rd Psalm when we're down? And how do we rejoice, Psalm 100, when we're up, and it becomes one of those things where we just say, I will walk with God regardless. The Lord is my shepherd when I walk through the valley of the shadow of death and by the still waters. And my cup will overflow. At the same time. And it's like, I want that deep a walk with God that my circumstances don't dictate. And I'm just, not that I'm perfect, But I find that the older I get, the more I'm like just assured that God has got this under control, and I can trust him, and I can just walk, because whatever is looming that I think is going to take the wheels off of the bus is going to be okay.
Right.
And when the bus is going really great, I know that doesn't define me or God.
Yeah. Good. Well, hey, great word. Thank you so much for teaching us this week. Thanks so much for bringing that out. We hope that you're encouraged. If you haven't yet read the chapter, spend some time doing it. I love the way the story weaves the Psalms in this week.
Yeah, it's great.
Next week, we'll see it a little bit with some of the wisdom literature from Solomon.
Yeah.
This is a fun time in the story, because we start to see the historical narrative interwoven with some of the prophets and all this stuff. So dig in. These next 6 weeks are going to be exciting. We hope that you're enjoying it. If you've been off for a few weeks, jump back in, because it is the greatest story ever told. It's your story, it's our story, it's God's story, and we want to be a part of it. So, hey, thanks for joining us this week. God bless you guys. We will see you Sunday. We will see you back here next week for the Story Podcast again. God bless you guys. Have a great week.